Okay, so the last pass that we require for all of our diffuse passes, our diffuse component, is a diffuse surface color pass. And this really needs to be a pass that we can use to get the equivalent of driving the Lambert-Vops diffuse color back when we were using an environment light and we set it to that orange and blue checkerboard by setting the diffuse color. We really need some pass that we can combine with our existing passes to get that same end result. And as we earlier discussed over on the whiteboard, we saw that we were simply going to output some pass that could be multiplied in with our existing lighting, and that would determine, well, which colors of light can a surface actually reflect at any given point. It's actually a very simple pass. It can either be a constant color for the entire surface of an object, or a color of a texture for a point on an object. Now, if we were to jump inside our shader, we can remember that we already have a texture being driven by UVs that's actually our checkerboard texture. So if we set up a pass to utilize this texture so that we can output the pass, set up all of the workflow for getting that pass and bring it over into compositing and show how that pass looks and how it combines back with the other passes. And then once we have that in place, we can add in the ability to switch between having a texture or having a constant color, get a load of parameters promoted up onto our asset and the likes. But to start out, I want to rename texture 1 to diffuse texture, and I want to take the color output of our diffuse texture, and this is simply going to be the color of a point on the surface based on the UVs used as a lookup into that texture. And that's all we want in our render pass. So if you think about it, the color of that texture on the surface determines the color of light that we want to reflect. And then we can take that and multiply it in with the lighting as we discussed earlier on the whiteboard, and that will give us the resultant color of the final rendered pixel in our diffuse component, if you will. So we can take this color and we can simply output it as a render pass. So I'm going to wire it into the last free input of our switch render pass, and then we can go ahead and set up the properties for our render passes to add this in as a render pass. So we need to start out by going to the type properties of our material, jump over to render pass, and add a new entry into the menu. So I'm going to add an entry for number 3, and this is our diffuse surface color pass, and accept. And then we can jump up to our output render settings, bring up the parameter interface for that, and do the same on this. So diffuse surface color, and accept. And now that we have those in place, let's create a new take. So append take, and we can give this take the name diffuse underscore surface underscore color. Now, please forgive the fact that I think for the pass I just was on autopilot and spelt it the American way, and then for the take I've spelt it the English way. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter if the names that we give to the menu of this parameter match up. All that matters is the idea of what that name implies linking over to this numeric value. That's what's important, because it's the numeric value that's driving our switch down in our asset. So the spelling of this, it could be American, it could be English, and even though if we accept this it doesn't directly match our material asset, that doesn't matter. It's what it implies. It implies that by setting it to that, we get the diffuse surface color pass, which sets that value to a value of 3, which sets our switch over to have an input number 3, which is going to grab that color from the texture that we just wired in. So we've got this take. We need to use this take. So I'm going to include in the take our render pass parameter of render settings. I'm going to set this to diffuse surface color, and then let's set ourselves back to the main take. And over on mantra 1, we can set this to render the diffuse surface color pass. And if I render that really quick, just give that a second to render. I'm just going to bring up the task manager to see when mantra stops rendering. There we go. So mantra has now rendered, which means if I jump over into our compositing view, and into our compositing network, let's bring up our network, we should be able to bring in those passes. So I'm just going to move to a clean area in this network, and I'm going to bring up our passes. I push backtick to load in multiple files. I want to bring in all of our test render passes, and I also, for comparison purposes, want to bring in the environment light with texture.pic if we accept this, there are our passes, and we're going to take the diffuse lighting pass along with the diffuse surface color pass. So we can see this is the pass we just output. It's a solid color based on a texture map lookup based on UVs. We can take that and multiply it with the lighting. And we're going to get this end result, which if we compare it to our environment light with texture, notice they're very, very similar. Again, we got those differences in the shadowing based on the approach we've taken, but they're working in a very similar way, and that's because of the way that the Lambert lighting calculations work when we specify a surface color. They take the resultant lighting that they've calculated and multiply it by the surface color at that point on the object, just as we've recreated in compositing. That means that the algorithm, the equations, if you will, for our lighting model based on our compositing network is identical in how it's treating our diffuse surface color as the Lambert VOP. And because we know that we got our lighting very close up until this point, so that our diffuse lighting looked very similar to the diffuse lighting coming from the Lambert VOP with the environment light without a surface texture, by multiplying in the surface texture we should expect to see a very similar end result. So let's jump back over into our shader. And inside our shader, I now want us to be able to switch between a diffuse texture and a solid color. So I'm going to start out, and let's actually promote the texture map parameter so that we can control that up on our asset. So I'm going to create a parameter node. I'm going to give this the name diffuse map. I'm going to give it the parameter name diffuse map, and I'm going to give this the label diffuse map. We can then create a new parameter VOP, and this is going to be for our diffuse color. So diffuse color. Give that the parameter name diffuse color, the label diffuse color, and I'm going to set this to be a color parameter. And on the color tab, I'm going to set the color default to white, just so that we have a white diffuse color by default, which would basically mean we don't manipulate the lighting at all. If we had a black color by default, that would mean when we first render out and composited everything together, we'd end up with no diffuse lighting whatsoever, which is obviously not what we want. So I'm going to right click on the output of our diffuse texture and create a new switch VOP, and that's simply so that I make sure the output is going into the correct input of our switch. But obviously we don't want the output of our texture to be the switcher, so I'm going to unwire that. We want that to go into our inputs. However, the order here is going to be important. I want to create a toggle to drive a 0, 1 value to switch our inputs, and that toggle is going to be called use texture. Its label is going to say use texture. That means when it's on and has a value of 1, I want to use the texture. That's meaning, therefore, when it's off and has a value of 0, I want to use the color. Thus, input 1 with an index of 0 needs to take our color. Input 2 with our texture needs to take our texture in because that has a value of 1. Thus, when we switch that toggle between 0 and 1, off, meaning we're not using a texture, gives us our color. On, meaning we are using a texture, gives us our texture. And we can middle click now on the switcher, create a parameter node for that, and we can call this something like diffuse map toggle. Set the parameter name to diffuse map toggle, set the label to use texture, but instead of having this simply as an integer parameter, we can set this to a toggle, which under the hood is basically just an integer, but it just goes between 0 and 1, and we're going to set this to be off by default. So now that we have these in place, we need to promote a number of these parameters up onto our asset. We need to promote up the texture map we want to use, whether we're using a texture map or using a color, and the color if we're using a color that we want to use. So I'm going to bring up the type properties for our material asset, and let's start out by from nodes down on our surface shader. I want to promote up, and I just want to make sure these aren't being prefixed. I want to grab our diffuse map, our diffuse color, and our use texture. I'm going to promote those into the diffuse folder, and I'm going to order these so that we have the color first, then our toggle, then our map. And I also want to create a separator between the sample parameters and these parameters. Now, if we were to apply this, take a look at our parameters now on our asset. We can see we have the ability to specify a diffuse color or a diffuse texture, and we can switch between them. What would be nice is to disable the appropriate parameters based on whether we are using that texture or not. So when use texture is disabled, it would be nice to have color enabled and the map disabled, and vice versa when we toggle it. And we know we can do that quite easily by, if we jump up and I want to grab the parameter name here, so I'm copying that parameter name, we can say that diffuse color is disabled when? Well, when we're using a texture, when diffuse map toggle is equal to a value of 1, we want to disable our color. And diffuse map needs to be disabled when that's equal to a value of 0. When we're using a color, the map should be disabled. If we accept, we can now see that we can toggle between these. So we're either using a diffuse color or we're using a texture. So let's set diffuse color just as a test to say, I don't know, a yellow value. And then we can re-render our path. So I'm going to jump over to Mantra, and I want to render our diffuse surface color path. So I'm going to render. Just give that a second to render. Let's make sure that Mantra isn't still running, so that should have rendered. And now if I jump over to our composite view, and over here into our composite view, bring up our network, there we go. If I was to bring in our diffuse surface color, you can now see we have pure yellow being output for our surface color, multiplied in with our lighting is giving us our diffuse surface color of yellow, which corresponds to what we're seeing here. Or we could switch over to use texture. Let's make sure that that indeed works as well. So we've switched over to use texture and jump over to Mantra 1 and re-render. Give that a second to render. So hopefully that should have rendered by now. So if we switch over to the composite view and bring this back in, there we go, we are now using our texture again, which means that we're getting a textured diffuse color. So it's a very, very simple pass, but it's a very useful pass, and the reason it's useful as having as just a separate pass is it allows us, if we want to change our textures to, you see how quickly this is rendering, to very quickly re-render this pass and not worry about recalculating our lighting and our shadowing. We're simply just dealing with the textures. Therefore, if we go in and we're painting a texture and we're slowly tweaking that texture to get it to look just how we want it to, we can render that pass and bring it back into compositing very quickly. If we're having to wait for all of our lighting to render, that would be a very, very slow process. So now that we've got that in place, we have all of the passes that together complement each other and define our diffuse component. So just to quickly recap the passes that we have our diffuse lighting pass that contains our environment-based lighting and shadowing, so we have the stronger sense of directional shadowing, and this is a main pass of our diffuse. We then have two passes, the ambient occlusion pass and our fill pass, that allow us to tweak the shadows in the general sense of shadows, not quite the directional shadows that we get with our diffuse lighting, but we can tweak the shadows with our ambient occlusion pass. There we go. And we can tweak the general fill lighting with our fill pass. And we looked at some compositing networks that take our ambient occlusion as it comes in by default and change it slightly for this particular render so that we have a nicer end result. And the same with our fill. So we saw that we could bring in our fill pass and manipulate that so that it works more nicely. But we don't have to do this. Obviously, this is all based in the end on how we're trying to integrate with our backplate, and we'd need to look at the manipulations we'd need to perform for our backplate. But for this quick test, it was quite easy to come in and say, well, actually, we don't want our ambient occlusion to run to grey. We want it to run to white. And we wanted our diffuse fill light to really be more of a fill and have less of a strong sense of contrast. And we saw that we simply multiply in a small amount of ambient occlusion and add in a small amount of fill to manipulate our lighting. So there's our three sort of lighting passes: diffuse lighting, ambient occlusion, and fill. And then we can take that and multiply that in with our diffuse surface color, and that's going to give us a textured diffuse surface, or just a solid color, diffuse surface, and that just gives us that extra control over the surface properties. Those 4 passes all combine to form our diffuse component, which now means that our diffuse component is indeed complete. And that means starting in the next video, we're going to turn our attention over to the reflections component. So that is going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot for listening, and I hope you guys join me in the next video to take a look at reflections. Thanks a lot.